within Freemasonry, we may see the idea of no tool of iron being used in the construction of King Solomon's temple as a metaphor of all aggression and war associated with Mars are removed from the temple when we begin the work. The same is true within the alchemical lab. The alchemists taught that everything in their doctrine can be described through symbols, and therefore it was the understanding of symbols and the symbolic language that allowed the alchemists to communicate. The next stage that an alchemist needed to do is he needed to choose a particular herb that he wanted to work with. All alchemy involves collecting things with planetary signatures, breaking them down in order to rebuild them in more perfect forms. So an alchemist would collect an herb, for example, let's say St. John's wort, which was ruled by the sun, and it was very important that the herb was pulled out by its roots in order that all essence was kept intact. Once that herb was pulled out by its roots, the next stage was to hang it up and allow it to dry. Once it was dried, then the next stage was to actually take the herb and by using a mortar and pestle, grind it up as fine as possible. To this day, there are some chambers of reflection which are used particularly within the entered apprentice degree in Europe and in some traditional observance lodges in which a mortar and pestle will be found. Once this herb was ground up as fine as possible, the next stage was to take this herb and place it into a vessel. Once it was in the vessel, the next stage would be to take a alcohol or spirits, fill the vessel up to a low water mark, and allow the oils from within that herb to start to digest into the solution itself. This was really the first stage of the alchemical process, and because it was so involved with liquid, it was associated with water. In order to further this process along, the alchemist would take the vessel and place it in what was known as a sand bath. Come here and I'll show it to you. Once the herb was placed into the vessel, it was then placed within a sand bath. What this allowed it to do is, as there was heat, the heat would become equally distributed around the vessel itself. The liquid within the vessel would start to heat up and circulate within the vessel. When this happened, it caused the oils to start to separate. The alchemist would be sure at the beginning stages of this work to then take the vessel out of the sand bath twice in 24 hours in order to shake the vessel very vigorously. This helped to separate the oils even further. Then it was placed back in the sand bath to allow everything to circulate. When this stage occurred, the herb was no longer associated with just an herb, but took on the new alchemical name of the caput mortuum. Caput mortuum literally means dead head, and it was sometimes symbolized in alchemical texts by a skull and crossbones. Sometimes it was depicted as a raven resting on top of a skull. But ultimately, it symbolized the first little death of the herb itself as it was washed within the vessel. Certainly, this beginning stages, any entered apprentice will find resonance within the actual penalties associated with his degree. The fact that this degree was associated with water, the herb was torn out by its roots, buried in the rough sands of the sea at a low water mark, where it was then shaken twice in 24 hours, after which it was called caput mortuum, associated with the dead head. So the fact that at this point then it's called dead head or caput mortem certainly has relevance related to the penal sign associated with the entered apprentice. True to not only alchemical texts, but the early rites of initiation of the Gnostics and even earlier Egyptian mystery schools, the first stage of initiation into the mysteries was always associated with water. Water was considered purifying. And in this first stage in alchemy, the liquid menstruum that we have, in this case using alcohol, represents that water, as we're cleansing the herb and literally giving it a baptism, if you will, to prepare it for its next stage. The next stage in the alchemical process, after the herb has digested and has gone through that water stage, is to take the herb in its vessel and distill it. Distilling it, what this does is it removes the heart and vitals of the herb, or the mineral components and the oils from the herb, and separates them from the body of the herb itself. When distillation happens, through heat, the vessel's heated up, the liquid then turns into steam. The steam rises up to the highest pinnacle of the apparatus, only to later fall and condense down like dew or rain into another vessel. In this way, all the essences from the herb have been removed. This next stage was associated with air because, as is very clear, the liquid as it turns into that steam is a form of air itself. In the alchemical texts, the stage was usually represented by birds or vultures, sometimes crows, picking at corpses and pecking out the heart and vital organs of the corpse itself, and then flying to the highest pinnacle of a athanor or a tower. An athanor was a alchemical apparatus which was used for distillation, among other things, which allowed these essences to be captured at the highest pinnacle. And oftentimes alchemical texts depicted them as a temple or as a church steeple in which they prayed at, because the work was deemed sacred. Within Freemasonry, such ideas are obviously alluded to again related to the penalty associated with the obligation of a fellowcraft. Just as the first degree was associated with water, the second degree then is associated with air. In it we find the idea of the birds picking out the heart and vitals and taking them to the highest pinnacle of the temple. Within Freemasonry itself, this idea of the distillation also relates to the fellowcraft. As he is, in the first degree, he is digesting all the experiences that he's been initiated into. But by the second degree, he's learning to distill it and break it down and figure out how to get the best essences out of this new craft. Sometimes what happens is, after all the essences have been distilled out, what is left over at the bottom of the vessel is the remaining ground up herb. And during the final stages of distillation, tiny holes will start to form in the ground up herb itself, and they look like prairie dog holes or ground squirrel holes in a field. The Masonic jurisdictions that talk about the beasts of the field, this is what it's alluding to, is this plain or this field that's created where all these tiny holes are formed that you would find snakes or other beasties crawling out of. Because that's exactly what we see within the vessel itself. One of the things that's also worth pointing out is that during the alchemical process, the herb goes through different stages at each level, where it turns black, red, and white. The first time during what we would associate with the entered apprentice degree, the green herb is picked, and as it dries out it turns kind of blackish. As it's subjected then to the menstruum or the alcohol itself starts to turn blackish at first, but with heat it begins to turn reddish. At the beginning of the fellowcraft degree, or the distillation stage of the process, this red liquid is then distilled over, and as it's distilled over, it comes out as a new clear or whitish solution. So it has gone from black to red to white through this first stage of the process. Once everything has been removed and distilled from the original vessel, what we have are then two components out of three which are required within the alchemical work. We have effectively removed what is called the sulfur of the herb, or the oils of the herb, and also the mercury of the herb, which was associated with the alcohol. And actually what the mercury was it was believed to be a vital life force which is contained within the air we breathe, and it's attracted to things like water and alcohol. In fact, this is where the word spirits gets its name from, for alcohol itself. So we have captured the mercury and the sulfur. There is one final element that we need to capture, though, which is called the salts of the herb. And ultimately, it was believed that the salts, the sulfur, and the mercury could be recombined in order to form a perfect stone. In alchemical texts, the salts were usually associated with corn or wheat. Since corn or wheat is a main body that's made up of all kinds of little seeds or little parts, just like matter itself can be broken down to all these little grains of the secret alchemical salt. The sulfur was associated with oil because it was the actual oils from out of the herb itself. And the alcohol or mercury was associated with wine, particularly since grapes and wine were associated with the sun in alchemical texts, but it was also very easy to draw alcohol from wine itself. So corn, wine, and oil then would go together to form a perfect stone, or salt, sulfur, and mercury, just like we find in cornerstone ceremonies within Freemasonry itself. In order to extract the salts, however, we needed to pull them from the bowels of the original vessel that we were distilling. At the bottom of this vessel, after we've distilled all the liquids out of it, is a remnant body, which is broken down and which the alchemists called feces, mostly because it stank. Didn't smell very good, and it kind of looked like feces. This residue that was left over at the bowels of the vessel then needed to be burned to ashes or calcinated in a crucible in order so that we could extract the salts out of it. So the crucible or calcination dish, which is what was used in order to calcinate down or torch down the actual feces or the residue that was left over, the dead body of the herb. Now what's interesting is in old alchemical texts, they used cipher symbols for the different stages of the work and for the different implements and lab equipment that was used. The symbol for a crucible or a calcination dish was actually a square with an inverted triangle at the top of it, looking almost identical to a master mason's apron. So the very symbol of a master mason's apron itself is the same shape as the alchemical cipher for a crucible or calcination dish.